One thing about Krishna Menon, though, which Bunty didn't mention, was that he was one of the founder editors of Penguin Books, which is incredible. It's something I learned recently. Yeah. And he was such a brilliant student that Harold Lasky of the London School of Economics said, he's the best student I've ever had. So you can understand why Jawaharlal Nehru had this special regard for him. Menon must have been truly a very, very brilliant man. He, of course, founded the India League, and he was very unpopular in the United States later on as a diplomat, mainly because of being a proponent of non-alignment, which I think John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State, called an immoral concept. Krishna Menon is also famous for the longest speech ever given at the United Nations Security Council. It lasted a full 8 hours. That should have made him a good Minister of Defense, but it didn't. But a word about Literature Live. We have these events, sometimes by ourselves, sometimes in collaboration with friends like Bunty and Asia Society. There are two a month at least, sometimes there are 3. The next one is on February 4, where we launch a very unusual book, which is about Mahatma Gandhi's favorite songs and his music. And it's going to be a musical evening, so that should be good. So keep a lookout for that. We also, of course, have the annual Mumbai International Literary Festival in November. All these events are free, and we depend on the kindness of sponsors. Some of them are here. They're trying not to look at me at this moment, but I will be seeing them soon. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Over to you.
Good. Oh, well, okay. Looking around me, I see that a lot of you must have followed Krishna Menon's life. I'm only judging from the color of your hair and whether you have any or not, like me. So, you probably have got the book now, and I hope you will read it, but Jairam Ramesh's book, by any standard, is an outstanding piece of scholarship. It is, in fact, a masterpiece. It shows the diligence with which the author has painstakingly extracted facts and opinions from a wide variety of sources and a great range of personalities who are associated with Vengalil Krishnan Krishna Menon, that's B.K. Menon. His earlier magnum opus, Intertwined Life, on the relationship between Indira Gandhi and P.N. Haksar, one of her closest advisors, is of a piece. I mean, it's in the same mold, and it also displays the unique blend of scholarship and diligence. As Ramesh writes, his purpose is to ascertain and not assert. Not a judgmental undertaking, but a pretty straightforward narrative undertaking. This is a political and diplomatic biography of an incredibly complex character whose contribution to our independence, both before and after independence, was through the medium of India's diplomacy in defense and foreign policy and its practice. Krishna Menon pursued what he thought was the country's interest in an unbridled way, often actually giving the impression that he may not necessarily be promoting the national interest, but he always was. Correctly, the biography dwells on his personal failures as well, but only to the extent that they are relevant to the narrative. Another interesting fact about Krishna Menon was that each and every time he was in trouble, he was defended by Jawaharlal Nehru, who was both in the public and in the parliament, who was his friend, associate, mentor, and soulmate. It may interest you to probably remember that it was from North Bombay that Krishna Menon actually fought an election in 1957 and in 1962. It made international headlines, and of course the left-leaning Krishna Menon had our film personalities, other professionals, academics, thronging to do something for him as far as this was concerned. Of course, you will recall that India was a far cry from the prosperity you see today. We were a really poor country. For me personally, the book brought back memories of a time I lived through, both through college and after I joined the Foreign Service. Coming again from an army background, Menon's tenure as defense minister, which was a disruptive moment in the senior echelons of our army, particularly involving Generals Thimaiya, Thorat, Thapar, and Kaul. They were a constant subject at the dining table. So I will now, with these few words, ask Ramesh to speak to you a little more about his book.
Well, let me start off by what you said about his association with Bombay. He was first elected from Bombay North in 1957 without campaigning and without being able to speak a word of Hindi or Marathi. He won by a thumping margin against a PSP candidate called Peter Alvarez. And in 62, which was perhaps the election which attracted the maximum international headlines and on which a book was to be written later on. In 62, he won by an even more handsome margin. He campaigned only for one day. Again, no Hindi, no English, no Marathi. And his election campaign in 57 and in 1962, a key figure was a man whose wife is sitting in front of us, who later on created the Nehru Center. Mr. Rajni Patel was a key figure in Krishna Menon's life from 1939 onwards. And both in 57 and in 1962, Nehru warned Krishna Menon that there is propaganda in the press that he's very close to the communists. So he should keep away from people like Rajni Patel and not stay with them. So Krishna Menon writes back to Nehru saying that I can't help it if communists are campaigning for me. And so Rajni Patel, Dr. Baliga, Dilip Kumar, Devanand, Raj Kapoor, Nargis, and most of all, Nutan. And in the book, there is a wonderful photograph of Krishna Menon with Nutan. So he was, from 57 till 1967, a member of parliament representing North Bombay. And he was the rage of Bombay at that time. So I just wanted to start off with that connection with Bombay. In 67, the Congress party denies him a ticket. And by then, he's very unpopular for his role in 1962. Mrs. Gandhi, who was a prime minister, is still politically very weak. S.K. Patil, the then uncrowned king of Bombay, makes sure that Krishna Menon doesn't get a seat. He contests as an independent in 1967. And he contests against the official Congress candidate, whose name, retired ICS officer called S.G. Barve. And there's something, a fact that is not known, but which has contemporary relevance. Mr. Barve's campaign was conducted almost entirely by the Shiv Sena. The Shiv Sena had just been created in Bombay, and it was popularly believed that the Shiv Sena's fathers were two congressmen, S.K. Patil and V.P. Nayak, who was then the chief minister of Maharashtra. And for many years, initially, the Shiv Sena was known as Vasant Sena. So the Shiv Sena conducted the campaign because the Shiv Sena was created in many ways by the Congress to counter communist influence in the trade union movement in Bombay, and which was dominated by the left parties, by the communist parties, and by George Fernandez's trade unions. And therefore, Krishna Menon was seen to be the archetypal communist, and the Shiv Sena then conducted this campaign. He loses, and then he goes to Bengal. He wins in 1969. S.K. Patil, who also loses in Bombay in 67, goes to Gujarat and gets elected in a by-election campaign. Both get elected, and both come into parliament. And Krishna Menon is asked, "What do you think about the future of India?" And Krishna Menon says, "An India in which Krishna Menon is elected from Bengal at the same time that S.K. Patil is elected from Gujarat, its future is very bright." So, with those introductory remarks, I think this is a biography of a man who, for 20 years, was India's most second written about man. He was the second most photographed man, the second most cartoonized man, the second most, commented upon man, and certainly the most disliked man. So that's Krishna Menon from about 1949 to 1962. He was Nehru's soulmate. He was Nehru's diplomatic representative, envoy. But he had a career before 1947, which we have forgotten in the caricature of him as the villain of 1962. He was the India League representative, created the India League, and for almost 15 years fought single-handedly for Indian independence in England. All Indians are led to believe that the Indian freedom movement was a revolutionary movement led by Gandhi in India. It was true, but Indian independence was also the product of negotiations between the Congress Party and the Labour Party, which lasted for about 10 years, in which Krishna Menon played the pivotal role in London, thanks to Lasky and Stafford Cripps and Clement Attlee, and Nehru on this side. Today, all over India, people are reading the preamble of the Constitution. We have discovered the preamble of the Constitution. The preamble of the Constitution was a draft given by Krishna Menon to Nehru, and subsequently it formed part of the Constitution. We all today swear by the Constitution and the Constituent Assembly, which created the Constitution. From 1933 onwards, Krishna Menon was the man telling Nehru that India must have a Constituent Assembly to draft the Constitution. And the man who opposed the Constituent Assembly initially was Gandhi, because he was not very sure that we can get all shades of opinion together to produce a constitution. It took a few years to convince Gandhi. Gandhi finally comes around, and as you know, the Constituent Assembly finally comes into being in December of 1946 to produce this magnificent constitution, which we have all suddenly rediscovered and we swear by. Even those who want to violate the constitution swear by the constitution. So, it's a remarkable piece of document. It's a typically Hindu document. It means everything to everybody. It's an Upanishadic document, in other words. If you want to have a point of view discovered, you will find it in the constitution. And in many ways, the Constituent Assembly is, I think, Krishna Menon's remarkable contribution in the pre-1947 period. So he has a career after 1947, which I'm sure you very well know, and we can have a conversation on that. And the reason why I wrote this book, I think it's important. Most political biographies in India end up being hagiographies, or they end up being exercises in demonizing the subject. We do not have a culture of political biography writing in India. We have had very few political biographers who are able to distance themselves from the subject. Rajmohan Gandhi is one great political biographer who has written biographies of Gandhi, Rajaji, and Patel. S. Gopal is another great political biographer who wrote a political biography of Nehru, and he wrote a remarkable political biography of his own father. S. Radhakrishnan, and he starts off by the biography, and it required tremendous courage on the part of a son to write of his father that Radhakrishnan was the result of a union of his mother with an itinerant Vaishnavite official, and which led to an estrangement between him and his family. So that's political biography writing. You can look at the subject very dispassionately. So, and also I believe most biographies in India are written as oral recollections, oral history. You interview people, you collect a few anecdotes, and it becomes a biography. So I wanted to make a break from the past, and therefore the 3 biographies that I've written in the last couple of years, first on Indira Gandhi, the environmentalist, then P.N. Huxer, and now Krishna Menon, is based entirely on written material. Entirely, not one piece of gossip or anecdote. It's all written archival material. In the case of Indira Gandhi, I was lucky that a lot of written material was available in the archives of one of the greatest ornithologists that India has produced, Salim Ali, who was responsible for making the Bombay Natural History Society the organization that it was. In the case of Huxer, it was Huxer's own archives and papers. And Krishna Menon left behind tens of thousands of papers going back to the 1920s. And they were finally opened for scholars in February of this year. So I've had no special access. It's all there at the Nehru Memorial and at the National Archives. So everything is based on written material, written archives in India, and archives that have opened up in the UK, the US, in China, in Russia, in Canada. So I was able to get a lot of material on different events of India's political history. So this is actually Krishna Menon speaking in many ways through the written record, and not somebody sitting in judgment. It's very easy to make him a hero. It's very easy. It's even easier to make him a villain. And I think the idea of a biography was, let's avoid both the extremes and try to figure out who this man was and what he represented in the times he represented.
Thank you for that. Let's go back to what you said, that if Krishna Menon is remembered at all at this distance of more than 50 years, it is inevitably because of the Chinese debacle. You probe a little bit deeper, and then they'll talk about, at least those who know will talk about the Jeep scandal, which was another negative thing. And of course, if they want to give him some credit, they'll talk about his marathon speech at the United Nations. But that's about it. As far as and I shudder to think how much the younger generation born after 1990 even know about Krishna Menon. So this leads me to my question, which is that certainly it's a remarkable historical narrative that you have put before us. To set the record, I wouldn't say straight, but to set the record, straight. And but how much do we now need to do it in Parliament, to sensitize people in Parliament and in the public, in order to have them understand the kind of remarkable figures that were instrumental in India's early days?
Well, I think it's very important to keep reminding ourselves frequently of the evolution of India's political and diplomatic history. You talked about China. China is very much part of our lives today. And the ghost of 1962 is still very much present in all our interactions with China. And it's very important to realize that Krishna Menon was the only man in India without exception, arguing from 1950 onwards that India must have a negotiated settlement on the border dispute with China. And Nehru was in sympathy with that point of view, but Parliament was against that view. The Indian media was against that view. The Indian socialists were against that view. And Nehru's own cabinet was hopelessly divided. You had Govind Vallabh Pant and S.K. Patil and Morarji Desai on one side, who said, not an inch of territory should be given off to the Chinese. And therefore, Krishna Menon was a voice in the wilderness. And for years, he argued that, we should have a swap deal, we should have lease. Long before Trump discovered the art of the deal, Krishna Menon was talking of the art of the deal with China. But the deal didn't fructify, and we had war, and, we were humiliated without any doubt in 1962. But it's very interesting, Mr. Abhyankar, that the man who opposed Krishna Menon was one particular young member of parliament who had just been elected to parliament, and he opposed Krishna Menon tooth and nail, and he kept arguing in parliament, getting up in parliament, speaking in eloquent, fluent Hindi, saying that India must not negotiate with the Chinese. And he wrote letters to Mr. Nehru, and they're all there in the book. Now, this member of parliament who argued against any settlement with China becomes Prime Minister of India in 96 for 13 days, in 97 for 13 months, and finally for 5.5 years in 99. And this Prime Minister goes to China in 2003, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And he signs an agreement with his counterpart in China. And that agreement, as you may recall, is that India and China will appoint special representatives to work out a border settlement through negotiations. Of course, we have been negotiating for the last 17 years. But in Indian and Chinese history, 17 years is a tiny speck. When President Nixon asked Zhou Enlai in 1972 what Zhou Enlai thought of the French Revolution, Zhou Enlai said, too soon to tell. So 17 years is a very short period, but I think this vindicated. And in the back cover of the book, you will find Indira Gandhi's tribute to Krishna Menon on his death, which she said, had Krishna Menon been listened to, we would not have had war with China in 1962. So we have to know this. We have to know the origins of our present predicament. General Timaya, a hero to your father, a hero to generations of people who've been in the army. General Timaya tells the UK High Commissioner, Malcolm MacDonald, at that time, my minister, he's plotting a coup against the Prime Minister. Can you imagine a serving army general telling the British High Commissioner that his minister is plotting a coup against the Prime Minister? Now, this is all available in his archives. And Timaya tells Malcolm MacDonald, my minister thinks that Pakistan is going to be India's greatest enemy, and he wants us to make peace with China. Today, we are trying to make peace with China, and if you ask any Indian on a straw poll, which is the country you think that you have the maximum differences with, the answer will probably be Pakistan. So we have to understand, I think, as part of politics, we have to understand history, how things have evolved, events have taken their own course. And it's not only important for members of parliament, I think it's important for the general public, it's important for students, it's important for scholars, that choices have had to be made which have resulted in the present situation. It's very easy to judge historical personalities with the benefit of hindsight. With retrospective judgments are the easiest to do. But I think what's more difficult to do is to understand why people acted the way they did in the context of their times. And that's, I think, one way of trying to understand Krishna Menon's contributions to Indian political and diplomatic history.
Very true. I mean, since we are talking China, Krishna Menon was actually instrumental in suggesting a deal with the Chinese sooner or later. Probably sooner, that's what he wanted. But if I am not mistaken, it concerns an exchange of sovereignty, more or less, between Aksai Chin and Ladakh. But today, we have a long border with China. They have pretensions to claim Arunachal as well. So I wonder whether if we had done a deal, whether these matters would have been laid to rest, or whether we would have then still had to give in again somewhere else.
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer.
I know.
It's a very, very difficult question to answer. The fact we could have done a deal in the 60s, and the deal was that we recognize Chinese sovereignty in Ladakh, and the China recognizes Indian sovereignty in the Chumbi Valley. But subsequently, the Chinese have started claiming Tawang. Incidentally, the Chinese occupied Tawang for 8 days in 1962 and withdrew lock, stock, and barrel. And Tawang, India came into possession of Tawang only in 1950, as you know. So, these questions of history can never be settled, Mr. Abhyankar. So, when historians write books making definitive statements, I would be very, very wary. Because history is very, there are multiple opportunities, multiple possibilities, and would the Chinese have respected a settlement with India? Well, they have respected settlements with other countries, so there's no reason why they wouldn't have respected a settlement with India. So this is a question that is virtually impossible to answer. But the question that can certainly be answered is that the option of signing an agreement with China existed, but the Indian Parliament, the Indian media, and Nehru's own cabinet was divided, and therefore the possibility of an agreement with China was completely missed. Can any prime minister sign an agreement today with China? Very difficult. Any prime minister which will involve transfer of territory will be very wary of signing an agreement with China. It's becoming, I think this is maybe an issue that will keep festering for hundreds of years, and maybe it'll just wither away with the passage of time. It's unlikely, but we'll keep negotiating. I think that's the only thing I can say.
Well, it's true, because it actually also harks back to the time when there was the proposal to give away Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and make the ceasefire line the border. But again, it fell on the same shoals. That is, how would the parliament react? And there was no way that it was ever going to be taken up by the government through the parliament, and we are still where we are. But let me turn the focus a little bit on the relationship between Krishna Menon and Jawaharlal Nehru. Because theirs was a dynamic which many people did not understand. So could you elaborate on this? Because it's very crucial to your biography.
Well, Nehru meets Krishna Menon for the first time in October of 1935. And it was love at first sight. I think Krishna Menon, Nehru discovered the brilliance of Krishna Menon, and Krishna Menon saw that Nehru was the future Prime Minister of India and therefore his ladder to success. So I think it was instrumental on the part of Krishna Menon, it was intellectual on the part of Nehru. Krishna Menon becomes Nehru's literary agent. He establishes Penguin. He starts Pelican, the low-cost edition of Penguin books. The first book of Nehru, which makes him a world figure, is called In and Out of Prison. And Krishna Menon tells him nobody is interested in reading a book by an unknown Indian leader called In and Out of Prison, that to a British prison. So he changes the title to Jawaharlal Nehru, an autobiography, and it becomes an international bestseller. And that starts the literary relationship between Nehru and Krishna Menon. The key to understanding the two is to understand that the beginning of the relationship was literary. They enjoyed books, they were part of the same British left-wing circle, and and Bertrand Russell, Harold Lasky, Stafford Cripps. These are all people who were part of their network. Soon after Nehru meets Krishna Menon, he writes to Krishna Menon that I'm sending a young man to London. He wants to study in the London School of Economics. So please help him out. That young man was Feroz Gandhi. So Feroz Gandhi then becomes part of, he becomes an acolyte of Krishna Menon. There's a photograph of a very young Feroz Gandhi, 1936, demonstrating along with Krishna Menon in London. In 1936, a year later, Nehru writes to Krishna Menon saying, my daughter is coming to study in Oxford. So Indira Nehru then becomes part of Krishna Menon's circle. And Krishna Menon then becomes Nehru's man in London. There were many organizations fighting for Indian independence. One of the most famous agitators for Indian independence is a forgotten man today, but he was a very important figure of Indian political history, Shapurji Saklatwala, who, incidentally, Gopal, was J.N. Tata's sister's son. J.N. Tata's sister's son became the third Indian to become a British member of Parliament. And guess which party he represented in British Parliament? The Communist Party. J.N. Tata's sister's son. Of course, the Tatas cut him off. So Saklatwala was a very important figure in India's freedom movement in Britain. But Saklatwala dies in the 1930s. And the scene was crying out for a man, a firebrand man like Saklatwala, and Krishna Menon fills that role. And the India League, because of his relationship with Nehru, becomes the central focus of India's independence movement, of the Congress's negotiations with the Labour Party. The only party that called for Indian independence consistently was the British Communist Party. And thanks to Krishna Menon, the Labour Party makes Indian independence part of its manifesto from the mid-1930s. And Menon and Nehru recognizes that. Another figure from Bombay who is a very important element of Krishna Menon's life in the 1930s is Minu Masani. And Minu Masani is a very interesting man. He was a communist in the 1930s, enamored of the Soviet Union, goes to the Soviet Union, writes a book on the Soviet Union. And then, of course, he becomes completely alienated, bitter, and he becomes the bitterest critic of Nehru and bitterest critic of Krishna Menon. And I think one lesson of Minu Masani's life is people who switch their ideological affiliations go from one extreme to the other. And that there is an old saying that, there is no Qazi more fundamental than a Naya Mullah. So this is what happened to Minu Masani. But Minu Masani, Krishna Menon and Nehru formed a trio in the socialist circles of the Congress Party. The Congress Party was a deeply, deeply conservative, middle-of-the-road, pro-capitalist, pro-bourgeois party, and the three socialists were Nehru, Krishna Menon, and Minu Masani. It's difficult to believe today, but these were the times of the 1930s. So politically, they were two very close spirits. Ideologically, they were very close. They were close to the Congress Party, to the Labour Party. They were enamored of the Soviet Union, certainly. They were very enamored of what the USSR had done. They were all people who were moved by what was happening in Spain, what was happening in Ethiopia, what was happening in China, which had just been attacked by Japan. So, answer to your question, Mr. Abhyankar, is that from 1935 to 1947, Krishna Menon is really Nehru's man in London. He's Nehru's literary man, he's Nehru's political man, he's Nehru's personal man. He's part of Nehru's family. And I think that's key to understanding the post-1947 relationship between Nehru and Menon. And really, Nehru was Krishna Menon's mentor. Even if Krishna Menon was Nehru's tormentor. Because, year after year, month after month, Krishna Menon would get into serious problems and Nehru would just bail him out. And Krishna Menon really survived in Indian politics because of Nehru's protection.
Very true. Very true. It is still very surprising that Nehru finally gave up on Krishna Menon quite a bit after the Chinese debacle.
Nehru didn't give up on him, Mr. Abhyankar. Nehru was forced to give up on him.
Yeah, well,
Nehru carried Mr. Krishna Menon's resignation letter in his pocket for 7 days. And the resignation itself is a telling commentary on the way Nehru operated. It was Indira Gandhi who went to the President of India, Radhakrishnan, and told Radhakrishnan, please save my father from himself. Please get him to accept Krishna Menon's resignation. And even then, Nehru would not move. Finally, on the 7th of November 1962, Nehru addresses 350 members of parliament of the Congress party. And one maverick congressman who is brutally honest to Jawaharlal Nehru, because he had known Nehru since he was a kid, Mahavir Tyagi. You must have, in your early years, you must have heard of Mahavir Tyagi. Mahavir Tyagi is famous in Indian diplomatic history. There was a debate on China going on in parliament, and he was speaking. And Nehru got very irritated. And Nehru said, hey, Mahavir, tum kya bolte rehte ho? Aksai chin, aksai chin. Not a blade of grass grows on aksai chin. So Mahavir Tyagi took off his hat and said, Pandit ji, mere sar pe ek baal nahi hai, does not make my head any less valuable. So this was the Mahavir Tyagi-Nehru relationship. So on the 7th of November 1962, Mahavir Tyagi gets up and says, either Krishna Menon resigns or you resign. Can you imagine a member of parliament of any party today getting up and telling the Prime Minister, demonetization was a disaster, resign. Not possible. Not going to happen. But it happened. It happened. And finally, Nehru recognized that his own position as Prime Minister was threatened if he continues with Krishna Menon. So finally, on the 7th of November, he accepts Krishna Menon's resignation. And I think the manner in which Krishna Menon handled himself after his resignation gave him new dignity and respectability in Indian public life. It's often been said that power corrupts. But I can tell you, if power corrupts, loss of power traumatizes. When a man is out of office, and when a man has no authority, when a man has no power, after he's exercised power and authority, he just does not know how to lead a normal life. And Krishna Menon kept his mouth shut, didn't write a memoir, didn't give an interview. I mean, he gave interviews, but always avoided speaking on 1962. Never one word of criticism of Nehru or the armed forces. Just kept quiet for 12 years. And I think in many ways, you may ask me, is there any lessons from Krishna Menon's life? I would say very few. But I would say there are many lessons to be learned from the way Krishna Menon handled his post-resignation life. With great dignity and with great respectability, that even his critics became his friends.
I mean, admittedly, Krishna Menon was not exactly the best material to become defense minister. But at the same time, he contributed greatly. In fact, he initiated the entire business initiated our defense production industry, which then, of course, grew from strength to strength. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes. Actually, before defense, in the 50s, Krishna Menon's name was Formula Menon. At the UN, he was called Formula Menon because wherever there was a problem, whether it was Korea, whether it was Cyprus, whether it was Algeria, whether it was the Suez Canal, the Americans hated him. The Britishers hated him. The Soviets suspected him. But they all knew that if they wanted a formula, they would need it to go to Krishna Menon. And Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, all through the 50s. So he becomes defense minister with this great international reputation for coming up with solutions to intractable problems. And he, in many ways, today, Mr. Narendra Modi is talking of Make in India. The first Make in India was, you'll be surprised if I tell you what was the first Make in India. India wanted to import fighter aircraft in the early 60s. And the choice was America, which was offering us Lockheed aircraft, the F series, the Britishers, who were offering us Hurricane aircraft, and the Soviets, who were offering us the MiG aircraft. Nehru's cabinet wanted us either to negotiate with the Americans or with the Britishers. You know, old habits die hard, British influence was still very strong. And Nehru himself was vacillating. He didn't want to antagonize the West too much, because by then the West had become a very important player in India's economic policy because of the foreign exchange crisis of 1958. So Krishna Menon said, any country that allows aircraft to be manufactured in India, we should go with them. The MiG was the first aircraft to be manufactured in India at HAL Bangalore. And that's how MiG-21 first came into India, and then subsequently HAL started manufacturing in this country. Defense research, the need for implementing defense research. The DRDO, of which Dr. Kalam became the director, the head of the DRDO in the 1990s, was Krishna Menon's creation. But Krishna Menon had one fatal flaw. He just couldn't get along with Sandhurst-educated British officers. And all the army of that time was this Paka Sahibs. And Manekshaw's idea of a joke was to hang a photograph of Clive and Hastings in the dining hall. Now tell me, Mr. Abhyankar, India has just rid itself of British rule in 1947. And here is Brigadier Manekshaw, the commandant of the Defense College in Wellington, wanting to play a joke on his minister. And he puts up a photograph of Clive and Hastings. Do you think it's going to endear him to anybody? No. And Manekshaw had to be in the cold storage for 4 years before Indira Gandhi rescued him and he became the hero of 1971. He and Timaya had this running problem because Timaya was, they were all Sandhurst educated guys. Thorat, Timaya, Thapar. So he detested hierarchy. He detested any sense of discipline, which unfortunately that's what the army stands for. So to that extent, and I've said so before, and I've said it in the book, he was the wrong choice as defense minister. He would have been very good as a foreign minister. He may have been very good as an education minister. He may have been very good as a planning minister. But as defense, you need to be able to work with hierarchies. You need to be able to work with a system that is based on a clear chain of command. And clearly, Krishna Menon was not a man for that. And so it was, even though his contributions, and in fact, after writing this book, many people have written to me saying that you have not highlighted the role of Krishna Menon in setting up Sainik schools. It's a fact. I mean, I did not mention Sainik schools. He was the one who thought of this idea of Sainik schools. In spite of all that, I still believe that he was not the best choice as defense minister, because you needed, in spite of everything, you needed somebody who could work with a system. He had a defense secretary called Pulla Reddy, who was an ICS officer. And Pulla Reddy was a typical ICS officer, quoting rules and regulations to Krishna Menon. And Krishna Menon would get very upset with him. And one day he said, what sort of an ICS officer are you? I say, Reddy, you neither pull nor are you Reddy. What are you, So it earned him numerous enemies in the civil service. He fought a running battle with Timaya. And let me tell you something else, which very few people know, and which is scandalous in today's time. The number 3 man in the Indian Army, General Chaudhary, who became a hero of 1965 and subsequently became India's High Commissioner to Canada, also considered to be one of the architects of the liberation of Goa. General Chaudhary, from 1950 to 1962, is moonlighting in The Statesman, writing articles twice a month with the byline by a military correspondent without official permission. And all news of the defense ministry and what was happening in Timaya and Krishna Menon was finding its way in the Statesman. But this was happening. This was India of the 1950s. So I think the relationship had broken down at the top level. And a defense minister who's unable to carry the top armed forces with him, whether it's the Navy, whether it's the Air Force, but in spite of all the ideas he had, he got India's first aircraft carrier, Vikrant, thanks to his friendship with Mountbatten. But he also resisted the appointment of the Chief of Defense Staff. It's very important. We have just appointed the Chief of Defense Staff now. The first time the proposal was made to Nehru was by Mountbatten in 1956. And Krishna Menon told Nehru, Chief of Defense Staff means the supremacy of the military over the civilians. And this is simply not acceptable in a democracy. And they did not agree, even though Mountbatten was very close to both Nehru and to Krishna Menon.
Well, in this context, perhaps you might like to elaborate a little bit on the Jeep scandal, because that's where one saw a certain cupidity on the part of Menon in trusting people who probably didn't deserve his trust.
He was a notoriously poor judge of men and a much better judge of women, much better. In fact, the India League was a one-man, many-woman army. Many young British women fell for this charismatic, tall, handsome, charismatic Indian figure. And many British women, some of whom have figured in this book, some with some photographs, who went on to have stellar careers later on in the arts, in science, and so on. They were all agitators for Indian independence. But as far as men was concerned, I think he was a very bad judge. And the Jeep scandal is a scandal in which no money was made by the man who was accused of making the money, but money certainly got siphoned off to support the India League. So you could say that this was public cause-oriented corruption. Some is need-based, some is greed-based. This was not greed-based, this was need-based. He was running India League, he was running the India Club, he was, producing pamphlets, producing publicity material. He needed money. So, on some jeeps, purchase of jeeps, he gave it to some of his cronies. Some additional funds were paid by the Indian government, and that money, additional money, came back to support the India League. In fact, that's the conclusion actually I've come to. After examining all the documentation and all the files, no personal money was made by Krishna Menon, which even his critics, by the way, did not accuse him of, but money certainly got made to support the India League, which was fighting for India's independence and continued to fight for Indo-British relationship. But it is a scandal that lives and is associated with Krishna Menon. And unfortunately for Krishna Menon, it forms a chapter in Khushwant Singh's autobiography, which is called, if I remember right, Truth, Love, and a Little Malice. Actually, Khushwant Singh's autobiography should be called Little Truth, Love, and Lots of Malice. And the maximum malice he had was on Krishna Menon. And he rakes up the Jeep scandal, talks about the Jeep scandal. And they had an eye for the same woman, Kamla Jaspal, who was in the Indian High Commission. I think Krishna Menon was the winner in that sweepstakes. And Khushwant Singh's frustration comes out in his autobiography. So a lot of stories got spun around this man, the Jeep scandal and his, womanizing and so on. But a lot of his positive stories are apocryphal. Many of his negative stories too were apocryphal. So I think the Jeep scandal in 1962 defined this personality, unfortunately.
However, let me just shift focus a little bit on Krishna Menon's lingering influence, if any, on the substance and style of Indian diplomacy. You write that the substance and style of Indian diplomacy was argumentative and combative. But perhaps it was because at that time, as the founders and leaders of the non-aligned movement, we needed to ensure that the flock was kept together. But since then, the world has changed, and so has the quality of our diplomacy. So how much of Krishna Menon's ideas still rule the roost?
Well, I think, as you said, he holds the record for the longest speech at the UN. He made 100 speeches at the UN over a 12-year period. And the longest speech was for 8 hours in 2 spells on Kashmir. And he spoke on every subject under the sun. And these are classics and now, thanks to YouTube, many of these speeches are available on YouTube. And they need to be both read and heard. But, it was argumentative. It was combative. It was scoring debating points. And that has not left us, Mr. Abhyankar. That has defined Indian diplomacy. It has defined Indian diplomacy all through the decades. We have been combative. We have been argumentative. We have been, and I found this to my constant irritation, thanks to your Foreign Service colleagues, when I was Environment Minister and I was negotiating climate change negotiations. And India's position when I became Environment Minister was, we don't have any responsibility for climate change. Why are we even doing anything? Why are we even negotiating with the Americans? Because, why? Per capita emissions of carbon dioxide is the lowest in India. This was the brief that every Prime Minister had continued from the mid-80s, thanks to Mr. Abhyankar's colleagues in the Foreign Service, who were all legatees of Krishna Menon. Now, anything in India per capita is going to be very low. The denominator is 1.3 billion. It is increasing by 12 million every year. So when Indra Nooyi comes to India, she will say, India is a huge market for soft drinks because per capita consumption of soft drinks is very low in India. I remember so many international CEOs coming and saying, per capita consumption of plastics in India is very low. Per capita consumption of soft drinks is very low. It has to be low. So this per capita emissions argument defined Indian climate policy for decades. We were argumentative. We went to climate change negotiations and we argued with the Americans. We did not contribute, you contributed. The carbon dioxide in the air, somehow, thanks to Indian negotiators, there is a made in USA carbon dioxide. There is a made in India carbon dioxide. There is a made in China carbon dioxide. And most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is made in America. I mean, ludicrous arguments we were giving. And as you know, you yourself, you've been through this in the system. Now, whether it was on climate change, whether it was on nuclear policy, whether it was on trade, whether it was on foreign relations, we delighted in scoring debating points. Our style was, because of the ease with which we use the Indian language, the English language, and the ease with which we could add square brackets, round brackets, footnotes in negotiating drafts. We were masters at this. And this is all in many ways, this is all Krishna Menon's legacy. Things have begun to change. Maybe I've been a little harsh on you, I'm sorry on this. But there have been individual exceptions. But you're right, in the 50s, India needed to be aggressive. India didn't want to be part of the Soviet camp, didn't want to be part of the American camp. But I think Krishna Menon needlessly irritated the Americans. In 1955, he almost got the Nobel Prize for Peace, in my view, for bringing about a rapprochement between the US and China. What Kissinger accomplished in 1971, Krishna Menon almost accomplished in 1955. He went to China for 8 days, secured the release of 4 imprisoned American airmen, went to Washington, spent 2 meetings with President Eisenhower and met John Foster Dulles, whom you quoted, the US Secretary of State. He met him 6 times over a period of 5 months and almost pulled off a rapprochement. But at the end of it, when somebody asked him what he thought of Dulles, he said his only response was, dull, duller, Dulles. Needless, I mean, you are at the point of, you're reaching the height, you're bringing about a rapprochement. What is the need to say dull, duller, Dulles? So a lot of this was his tongue. And the argumentative Indian, which Amartya Sen has written about, is epitomized in Krishna Menon's life. And I think that's what I meant by saying the style and substance of diplomacy. The Chinese don't talk much. The Chinese are very quiet. They operate below the radar, and they're willing to cede space to the others. But the Indians are far more aggressive. We are far more articulate, maybe because international negotiations take place in English. And therefore, that legacy of Krishna Menon continues to define Indian foreign policy. He invented the word non-alignment, by the way, in 1953. So.
Yes, I mean, we do probably, we are more argumentative, but at the same time, our reputation also hinges on the fact that we are good drafters of documents. But that having been said, let me ask one last question before we give some time to the audience, and that was about Krishna Menon's very staunch opposition to nuclear, to the atomic bomb and all that. How would he look at India today when we have a very important nuclear deterrent?
Well, let me bring another great son of Bombay into this conversation. Krishna Menon had a running bet with Homi Bhabha from the 50s because he believed that Homi Bhabha had somehow managed to convince Nehru that India must go nuclear. And Krishna Menon was consistently a voice against India going nuclear. But he was far-sighted enough to realize that we need nuclear power, and therefore he's one of the main figures for creating the Indian International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. But when it comes to acquiring nuclear weapons, even after China goes nuclear in 1964, China went nuclear in 1964 and they tested the hydrogen bomb in 1967, Krishna Menon didn't waver in his opposition. On the 18th of May 1974, India went nuclear. He was dying. He had only 5 months to live. He was dying in the GB Pant hospital. He calls the Prime Minister and gives her a 2-hour dressing down on why India should not go nuclear. And gave her all the arguments, how it's a betrayal of her father, betrayal of Gandhi, betrayal of India's freedom movement. And he was passionately, irrevocably committed to a nuclear-free India and a nuclear-free world. In fact, in many ways, Krishna Menon was the first man to start talking of disarmament at the UN. And his speeches ultimately culminated in the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which was a treaty that was signed by the USSR, the USA, and the nuclear powers, a partial test ban. Atmospheric tests were banned, but underground tests were not banned. That was a victory in many ways for Krishna Menon. So he was dead opposed to Krishna Menon, to nuclear weapons. And he was actually, it's very interesting. I must bring another person of Bombay fame into this debate, Morarji Desai, who was Chief Minister of Undivided Bombay for 6 years. Morarji and Krishna Menon had a constant running battle. Krishna Menon was Defense Minister, Morarji was Finance Minister. Every time Krishna Menon asked for more money for defense, Morarji Desai would tell him, defense? In a land of Gandhi? Do we need weapons? Do we need an army? So Krishna Menon sends him a long proposal for restructuring of the Indian army, and Morarji Desai writes to Nehru saying, this is unacceptable. Why do we need so many generals? We are committed to ahimsa. We are committed to non-violence. We are the land of Gandhi. We should not be investing so much in defense. This is a story from 58 to 1962. After the Chinese War, Krishna Menon has resigned. Krishna Menon's officers go to Morarji Desai, who's still finance minister, to ask for money to build rifle factories. So Morarji Desai says, I've seen this proposal before. So the officer says, yes, sir, we had come to you 2 years ago for 2 factories. So Morarji Desai said, what's the problem? Have 4 factories. This is post-China. This is the post-Chinese invasion. The point I want to make is, right through the 50s, the generally politically accepted position was India should not be spending too much on defense. Because we have development, we have education, we have health. Most importantly, we are the land of Gandhi. So we should not be spending too much money on defense. That, of course, begins to change after 1962. And today, if you argue against increased defense spending, you stand the danger of being called anti-national.
Thank you very much. I think I'll now move to the audience. Please feel free to ask any questions. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious to know what was, between 1935 and 1947, Krishna Menon's attitude to partition.
Maulana Azad wrote a book called India Wins Freedom. And there was a secret chapter in that memoir, which came out immediately after his death. And his instructions were that that chapter should be released 30 years after his death. That chapter was released in 1988. Azad blames 2 people for the partition of India. Sardar Patel and Jawaharlal Nehru. And he blames 2 people for convincing Krishna Menon to agree for convincing Nehru to agree to partition. Edwina Mountbatten and Krishna Menon. He says Lady Mountbatten because of Lord Mountbatten's pressure, but more importantly, that mischievous Krishna Menon was the one who worked on Nehru to convince Nehru on partition. Now let me tell you what the archival evidence suggests. The archival evidence suggests that Nehru and Patel both were deeply ambivalent about partition. They did not want partition, but they realized that after 1940, politics of India had changed dramatically. The atmosphere had become very communal, particularly after the communal riots in Calcutta of 1946, and partition was becoming increasingly inevitable. So they came to partition not out of conviction, but out of compulsion. And it is a fact that in the transfer of power negotiations, there's also an interesting aside here. The 2 people responsible, the man who made up Nehru's mind on partition was Krishna Menon. The man who made up Sardar Patel's mind on partition was VP Menon. So there were 2 Menons there. And there is a member of Mr. VP Menon's family sitting in the audience who will bear me out. So VP Menon, who hated Krishna Menon and vice versa, VP Menon was advising Sardar Patel. In fact, in many ways, VP Menon was the father of partition. The man who suggested the partition of India was VP Menon. The man who sold the idea of partition as no alternative to Nehru was Krishna Menon. And this is all borne out by archival evidence. But I think, Gopal, by the mid-40s, the Indian political leadership had begun to realize that it's not possible to have, to go forward without partition. And the British were playing a dirty game. The British game was that we will give dominion status to all the princely states of India. That was the mischievous element in the British plan, which all of us forget today, which means that All the princely states would owe allegiance to the Queen of England, to the Crown of England, and not to. And Krishna Menon kept saying, India is a republic, India is a republic, India is a republic. And that is what doomed the cabinet plan, because the cabinet plan of 1946 was predicated on transfer of power to two Dominion states and the princely states, which was unacceptable to the Congress party. So partition had become inevitable, and I think both the Menons played a very important role in this. In fact, the joke in the 1950s was the government of India suffered from meningitis because Sardar Patel's chief advisor was VP Menon. Krishna Menon was Nehru's closest ideological confidant. Foreign Secretary was KPS Menon. Our ambassador to China was KM Panikar, also a Menon of sorts. Panikars, Menons. The director of the Intelligence Bureau was TG Sanjeevi Pillai, another Menon. So you had all this, and Nehru's private secretary was M.O. Mathai. Mathai is a Syrian Christian form of Menon, that's all. So you had all, this was the Malayalis who controlled the Indian bureaucracy in the 50s, just like in fact, the story of the Indian bureaucracy of the 50s and the story of Indian bureaucracy today is a story of how India has grown in the last 70 years. 5 communities dominated Indian bureaucracy in the 40s and 50s. First were the Malayalis. Second were the Tambrams, the Gopalakrishnans and the Ramachandrans and the Ramadurais and the Subramaniams. The third were the Kashmiri Brahmins, Haksars, Dhars, Kauls, Kadjus, Vanchus. Fourth were the Kayasthas, the Saksenas and the Mathurs. And the fifth were the Banerjees and the Chatterjees and the Mukherjees. Now, if you look at the Indian bureaucracy today, you won't find any of these guys. The reason why they dominated Indian bureaucracy in the 40s and 50s is they were the first to take to English education. They were the first to get professional education. But more importantly, they made sure others didn't have access to it. Very important. What the Indian Constitution did was liberalized access to education for these non-privileged communities. And that's why today, if you look at the Indian bureaucracy, you won't find Kashmiris. In the foreign service also, you will not find any Kashmir. Very few. You find 1 or 2. But there was a time in which these 5 communities dominated policy making in Delhi.
I thought you would also cover, sorry, I don't want to, Gandhi in your comment as to what was...
Gandhi was dead opposed to partition.
No,
Huh?
to Krishna Menon.
Oh, Gandhi and Krishna Menon meets Gandhi in 1931. Krishna Menon was befuddled and totally confused by Gandhi. He just did not understand Gandhi. And there is a long letter from Krishna Menon to Nehru saying, what is this Gandhi doing? What is he saying? Does he understand how the world functions? And Nehru writes back a long, patient letter saying, you don't understand the way Gandhi functions. What Gandhi says makes India move. And behind what Gandhi says, there is a message. So understand Gandhi. Gandhi can be frustrating. Gandhi can be, perplexing. But Gandhi captures the spirit of India like none of us have. And that exchange on Gandhi between Menon and Nehru is very revealing. Menon was never a Gandhian. Never. He was suspicious of Gandhi's antipathy to science. He was not enamored of Gandhi's village industry, back to the roots, khadi, and so on. In fact, in 1945, there is an exchange between Gandhi and Krishna Menon. Gandhi is talking about charka, charka, charka. So Krishna Menon sends him a long letter on how to design and improve charka. That letter is in the book, by the way. I was able to get this. Very interesting. He sends him a long letter on how to... Imagine sending a letter to Gandhi on how to design and improve charka. So Gandhi writes back a letter to Krishna Menon admonishing him, saying, whoever has advised you does not understand how charkas function. And gives Krishna Menon a long lecture on how charkas function. And then finally ends the letter by saying, beautiful ending. He says that the man whom I admire the most in the world is the man who invented the Singer sewing machine, because he freed women from hours of drudgery. I am looking for another man who will produce millions of such machines in India, but your advisors cannot produce an improved charkha machine.
But you're talking of the relationship between Morarji Desai and Menon. Are we to understand that, in a sense, Morarji Desai was the villain of 1962 and was responsible for the fiasco of the war?
You know, T.J.S. George, who's still alive, 84 years old, wrote the first biography of Krishna Menon in 1964. He's a very distinguished journalist. I think he was editor of the Free Press Journal also in Bombay. So I asked Mr. George, what would you have written differently now, which you didn't write in 1964? He said two things. I would have written more frankly about Krishna Menon's women friends, number one. And number two, I would have written more openly about how Morarji is the real culprit of 1962. By not allowing India's rearmament and constantly scuttling Krishna Menon's plans for reorganization of India's defense. And of course, he then adds, Mr. George adds, that it is not a coincidence or a surprise that Morarji Desai has got Pakistan's highest civilian award.
I have, yes, please, sir. The one right at the back. Could you give him the mic?
Is there another mic?
Thank you. First of all, my compliments to Jairam ji Ramesh for the excellent speech, as good as you're speaking in the parliament. We really enjoyed it. Sir, I am born in 57, but I have been reading through the books and letters that it was Mr. Krishna Menon who misguided Nehru on China. Is it true? Because I have been nurturing these thoughts since last 50 years that Nehru trusted Krishna Menon so much that he said the Hindi China bhai bhai. And Mr. Menon said that no, China would never attack us. And he was the person who misguided Nehru. Is it true, sir?
5 months before China attacked India, General Timaya, the hero of the Indian Army, wrote an article in a magazine called Seminar, which is still, very popular magazine, an intellectual magazine. And General Timaya, who hated Krishna Menon, and again vice versa, General Timaya writes, in July of 1962, India should never go to war with China. That the only way India's problems with China can be solved is through political and diplomatic engagement. We can never have a war with China. This is the top Indian Army general writing 5 months before the Chinese decide to invade India. I don't think Krishna Menon misled Nehru. I think Nehru was equally committed to building closer relationships with China. He goes to China in 1954. He meets Mao, he meets Zhou Enlai, and he wanted certainly closer relationships with China. Both Krishna Menon and Nehru were very closely associated with China issues. There is a letter from Mao Zedong to Krishna Menon of 1938 in the book, because Krishna Menon played a very important role in raising international support for China after Japan attacked China. So both of them saw these two civilizations, the Indian civilization and the Chinese civilization. I don't think they got misled. But I think it is true that Krishna Menon spent far too much time outside India as defense minister than in India. He was also our envoy to the UN. So that means for almost 3.5 to 4 months a year, he was away in New York. So when the Chinese were building all these forward posts in Ladakh and all the other places, our defense minister was making stirring speeches in the United Nations. Now, you need a full-time defense minister. India didn't have a full-time defense minister, I'm afraid, from 57 to 62. And that was a mistake that Mr. Nehru made in not having a full-time defense minister. I don't think Mr. Nehru was misled. I think they all believed that a negotiated settlement was needed. But as I explained to you right at the beginning, Nehru's cabinet was divided. Parliament was not for a negotiated settlement. The media was not for a negotiated settlement, and therefore Krishna Menon was a voice in the wilderness as far as China was concerned.
I have one more. Yes, please. Yes. Could you give him the mic, please? I thought I'll ask you after. Yes, please.
Ajit, you. The mic is free.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I thought I'll
sorry.
go to the back first.
To the back.
So that they get
The chairman
The chairman will take a call.
Okay, since we don't find a mic, can I just
Yeah, sure.
use my lungs? You made, I really have two questions. You made one point that it was Nehru and Krishna Menon who right from the beginning wanted a negotiated settlement with China. But it was the parliament and the press and everyone else was against it. But given Nehru's huge supremacy right through the first decade of independence, right up to 1960-61, would that, the very fact that the parliament and others were against him, would that have stood in the way? The second one is, can you throw some light on General Kaul, who from all that I have read seems to have been the most incompetent person ever. I don't know if that is true, but I've read a lot about it. Why was Krishna Menon so keen on pushing him? Sorry? On pushing him. He gave
General Kaul.
General
General
Kaul.
Kaul.
Yeah. Okay. Let me take the first question first. Nehru, after 1958, it's the autumn of the patriarch. The decline of Nehru begins in 1958. He is not well. He's suffering from health problems. Politically, he is under siege. India has the first foreign exchange crisis in 1958. What crisis we had in 91, we first had in 1958. And the consequence of India's economic crisis in 1958 is that the Americans become stronger in India. The West becomes stronger in India. Till 1958 is the Soviet Union that is playing an important role in India's industrialization. But after 1958, when the Aid India Consortium is set up, we begin to depend on the Americans for PL 480 wheat. We begin to depend on bilateral aid from the World Bank. Nehru becomes far more sensitive to the right-wingers in his cabinet, which is basically S.K. Patil, Morarji Desai, and most of all, Govind Vallabh Pant, who is the Home Minister. So Nehru, contrary to popular belief, after 1958, does not enjoy unquestioned supremacy in the Congress Party, which he had from 1947 to 1958. That's one reason why Krishna Menon is not able to sell the idea of a negotiated settlement. In 1960, when Chow En-lai comes to India for the last visit to solve the border problem, Krishna Menon is not even part of the Indian official delegation. Govind Vallabh Pant insists that Sardar Swaran Singh be with Nehru on its side, and Krishna Menon is not there. But the man whom Chow En-lai meets the maximum informally is Krishna Menon. But by then it was too late. The politics of India did not dictate a settlement. Had Nehru decided to risk a settlement in the early 50s, maybe he had that political clout at that point of time. But after 1958, I'm afraid, Nehru was not in a position to impose his will. And in any case, Nehru's style was not my way or the highway. That was not his style. There are some prime ministers who believe it's my way or the highway. They'll go unnamed today. But Nehru's style was not to say, this, otherwise go away. His style was to take everybody along. And he couldn't take his own cabinet along. He couldn't take parliament along. He couldn't take, certainly, Indian public opinion along. General B.M. Kaul is a very interesting figure. He's actually the villain in the book in many ways. Very fascinating figure. B.M. Kaul appeals to Nehru because even though he is Sandhurst educated, he's not the Paka Sahib, stiff upper lip type. He's not the clipped accent type. He's a Desi. And he, in 1946, gets appointed by the defense minister then, Sardar Baldev Singh, as the secretary of a committee to nationalize the Indian armed forces. That was the name of the committee. So General Kaul comes to the attention, and contrary to what most books write, there is no remote relationship of General Kaul with Nehru, although Nehru's wife was Kamala Kaul. There's no relationship whatsoever, remote or even remoter. But Kaul becomes the archetypal military bureaucrat. There are two types of military men. There are military men who excel in military bureaucracy, and there are military men who excel in military operations. Kaul was an example of the first military officer. Timaya was so impressed with him, he took him to Korea in 1953. He made him quartermaster general in the army. If you needed something done, if you wanted to get a building done, if you wanted to get houses done, if you wanted to get anything done in the army, you went to Kaul. Unfortunately, Kaul did not have any field experience. But he was given charge of an operational command in Nefa, which then became Arunachal Pradesh. And that was a strategic blunder. That was a strategic blunder on the part of both the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister, because this would not have happened without their approval. Kaul goes there, falls ill, comes back to Delhi, is recuperating in Delhi, then goes back and stays for a day and takes General Harbakh Singh, the great hero of 1965, is replaced. Kaul goes back, and then we have the retreat, and then we have the humiliation in Nefa. So Kaul, in many ways, was a wrong choice. But can you blame General Kaul? I don't blame him. I blame the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister. They were the ones who appointed him. And they appointed him knowing that he did not have operational command experience, that his forte was military administration and military bureaucracy. And I think maybe they just completely misjudged him.
Yeah, Jairam, you mentioned, apart from Menon, Homi Bhabha was close to...
By the way, all these mistakes of 1962 get rectified in 1965, and most importantly, get rectified in 1971. And in 1971, the most important lesson learned was that the Prime Minister is not directly in charge of defense preparedness. In 1962, when Krishna Menon resigns, Nehru becomes defense minister. And when the Chinese invade India the second time, China invaded India twice, first on the 20th of October, and then on the 16th of November. When they invaded India the first time, Krishna Menon was defense minister. When they invade India the second time, Nehru was a defense minister. In 1971, Indira Gandhi had learnt from her father's experience, and she allowed P.N. Haksar to do the diplomatic and the military and the political maneuvering which was required, and they gave full freedom to Manekshaw, General Arora, General Jacob, and the entire Indian Army. So in many ways, the lesson of 62 got internalized by the political establishment in 1965 and in 1971.
You mentioned, apart from Menon, Homi Bhabha was close to Nehru, and another person was Mahalanobis, whose influence, of course, was felt in the first three plans. So what was the relationship between Menon and Mahalanobis?
You see, one of Nehru's great qualities was he was not close to any politicians. He was close to all non-politicians. If you look at all the people close to Nehru when as Prime Minister, you find Bhabha, you find Mahalanobis, you find, in many ways, Krishna Menon. He's not an archetypal politician. You had Bhatnagar, then you had people like PMS Blackett, British scientists. So he was close to people from outside the political world. And I think it's important for prime ministers to have this antenna out to people who populate the world outside politics. And Nehru was great at this. But one problem with this is they were all prima donnas, and they were all fighting for Nehru's mind space, right? So there's a lot of internal wranglings between Bhabha and Krishna Menon, a lot of wranglings between Mahalanobis and Krishna Menon. But ultimately Nehru was able to manage all of them because they were able, each of them got a niche. Bhabha got the science niche, Bhatnagar got the CSIR niche, Krishna Menon got the foreign policy and defense niche, Mahalanobis got the planning commission niche. So all of them, I think the great lesson of the 1950s, with great contemporary relevance, prime ministers need to get talent from outside the political system. They must know how to get that talent, number one. They must know how to use that talent, number two. And number three, they must learn how to retain that talent. Unfortunately, all these three talents have been violated in the last 5 years.
Sir, a quick.
Sorry,
Just
I have somebody at the back. You can ask afterwards. Next one.
We combine the two questions.
yeah.
Okay, let's do that. You ask your question, then he'll ask. Then Mr. Ramesh can reply.
Could you just, so far we've been hearing about more political, strategic, stories and narratives around Krishna Menon. But I think that you have referred to the making of Krishna Menon, the early life of Krishna Menon. Krishna Menon as a child, his relationship with the family. You know what I'm trying to raise here in a biography, the so-called Freudian or Lacanian twist and turn. I mean, I'm a student of Ashish Nandi, so whenever I get the time, I pounce on politics in terms of the Lacanian twist. I'm told that, his mother kept a lot of elephants, and one of the elephants was known as Gopalan. And I'm not surprised that Menon has elephantine memory. So could you just, refer to what in a psychoanalysis we call on the couch, Because he was very, kind of a psychotic, depressive, anxiety prone, We never talk about, in the making. I've worked with you. You are my former boss. So I've seen you that how positive, optimist, and evangelical you are. So please elaborate on that. Thank you.
I've also read somewhere that when China occupied Tibet, we were in a military position. We had the military superiority to push them out. But it was Krishna Menon who dissuaded the Indian government from doing that. Is there any truth in that?
Answer is categorical no. Because, it may have been true, but I couldn't find any written evidence of it in any Indian or English archive. And if Krishna Menon had had a role, you can be rest assured there would be some scrap of paper in his almost illegible handwriting somewhere. Because he belonged to a generation which committed their thoughts to paper. He had absolutely no role in dissuading. I think Nehru was convinced that India was not in a position to take China on in 1950. That India had embarked on this great experiment in building a democratic socialist society. Our priorities were economic policy, and we could not be challenging the Chinese over Tibet. And I think that was the real... was Girija Shankar Bajpai arguing for India attacking and going to war with China in 1950? I think that would have been a worse disaster than what happened to us in 1962. So I think the critics of Nehru on 1950 have to make a stronger case that India could have confronted China more effectively on Tibet. So the answer to your question is absolutely no. I do not want to get into psychohistory because psychohistory is notoriously unreliable. It tells more about the guy who's writing the book than about the guy on whom the book is being written. So I do not want to get into psychohistory, although Krishna Menon is a fit case for psychohistory, and I would request you to do it because there's enough material to make a psychological profile. But I will say this, that Krishna Menon was first discovered, and another person closely associated with Bombay, India, he was first discovered by Annie Besant. Now, most Indians today don't even know who Annie Besant is. They only know Annie Besant Marg. And that too, in some places, it is not even written Annie Besant Marg. It is written Dr. A.B. Marg. So many people may think that it is some Ahalya Borgaonkar Marg or something like that. But it is Annie Besant Marg. Now, Annie Besant, a forgotten name in Indian history, was for the pre-Gandhian phase of Indian politics, the most charismatic figure. She was an Irish woman who had made India her home, settled down in Adyar, and telling the Indians, at that time Indians meant upper caste Brahmins, educated, that India had a glorious legacy of Hinduism, and Buddhism, and you must get these Britishers out of India. So Home Rule movement starts in Maharashtra with Lokmanya Tilak, and it starts with Annie Besant in Madras. And Annie Besant is a mentor to a whole generation of Indians, of which Krishna Menon is one. In fact, I've written in the book that Annie Besant's great contribution to India is that she discovered two Krishnas. One was Jiddu Krishnamurti, who becomes a great philosopher, seer, and so on. And the other one was Krishna Menon. And it is she who sends Krishna Menon to England in 1924 to teach in a Theosophical Society school for 6 months. And he goes to England and stays there for 29 years. So Annie Besant plays a very important role. And the only psychological thing that I have done in this book is to highlight the role of the Theosophical Society in our freedom movement. Nehru was a member of the Theosophical Society when he was 13 years old. He became a member. His first tutor, who introduced him to the world of books, was Ferdinand Brooks, who was a Theosophist. Krishna Menon was a Theosophical Society person, and most people of that generation, most public men of that generation, belonged to the Theosophical Society. C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, another great name of Indian political history, was Annie Besant's right hand. So I think if you're looking for formative influences, I don't think you'll find them in elephants, but you'll find them in Annie Besant.
So, thank you very much. I think it has been an exhilarating discussion and a fantastic book. Oh, I didn't see you. Okay, we'll let you. Sorry. So I didn't see your hand, so okay. Yeah.
I've not read your book, and probably we know each other sometimes back when I was in the parliament. But I have been in close touch with a number of people that you mentioned when they were serving. And therefore, I am not relying on archives or books, and I will read your book. I find it very interesting. But 2 points definitely I wish to put to you. One of that is that I was in the army with some service at that time, that there was a feeling that because of Krishna Menon, the Indian army was not prepared. Okay, I agree that we could have negotiated or we could have not. But I do believe that you negotiate, but you keep your powder dry. It's not as if you can say that the finance minister doesn't give me money. And if you're such a favorite of Nehru, then surely, after all, it was the finance minister versus the home minister, Sardar Patel, that mainly led to the partition of India, because everything that he saw, a stand should have been taken. The second thing that weakened it, I know B.M. Kaul, personally worked with him, that a sense of favoritism came into the army. And you may not like the Manik Shaw or any other this thing, but there is no doubt about it that people like Manik Shaw were thrown aside. So I feel that while it's not a very good thing to criticize as a hindsight, at that time what happened, one could know. But one feels that 62 was a very traumatic experience for our country. And that could have been avoided. It's the same army which has brought glory later on. So I feel that he must take that much of responsibility for the trauma that this country has undergone vis-a-vis China. We've never got over it. And I was in 62 in the army, and we've never got over it.
Well, I'm glad you raised this. I'm very grateful that you made this point, and this is a final point. We shouldn't have gone out from here without the question that you have raised. You know, all the stories of 1962, the first stories came out from military men. Brigadier Dalvi was the first man to write the Himalayan Blunder, and then came a series of books. The story of 1962 has always been told by military men. And the military men have always pointed the finger at the political class. Nehru and Krishna Menon have never spoken. They took it on the chin. So I wrestled with this question. How do I handle this question in the book? It would be intellectually dishonest of my part not to handle, not to see. Then I discovered that the father of the current Foreign Minister of India, K. Subramaniam, who is India's foremost defense expert, had given an interview to somebody, and I was able to get the transcript of that interview. And this interview was given in 1988. And Subramaniam says in that interview, which I have quoted, that the failure of 1962 was a failure of military command. And this was, of course, the military command was determined by the political leadership. But it was fundamentally a failure of the military command, which then transferred the responsibility of 1962 to the political leadership. I have quoted K. Subramaniam, but I have addressed this issue by saying that the responsibility for sending General Kaul to a place where he was ill-suited was that of Nehru and Krishna Menon. So they cannot avoid that responsibility. So I think the truth of 1962, with due respect, is far more complicated than what the army has led us to believe. The army was deeply divided. Timaya and Thorat and Thapar were at each other's throats. There was a general called General S.P. Verma. General Timaya tells Krishna Menon that Verma should not be promoted because the smell of his wife is not right. This is a note by Timaya to Krishna Menon. It's there in the book. And Timaya writes to Nehru saying 2 days later, the same Timaya comes and says, Verma should be promoted. So the smell is right now. I mean, these were the games that were being played. And let me tell you, sir, if I was the minister, and if one of my colleagues hung a photograph of Clive and Hastings, I would probably have the same reaction, as maybe not as extreme as Krishna Menon. I would have called the officer and I said, "Ye kya mazak ho raha hai?" But Krishna Menon took it to an extreme. The point I wish to make is just simple. Don't want to absolve the political establishment for what happened in 1962. Because ultimately it is the political establishment that was calling the shots. They appointed the people. They appointed the army chief. They appointed the operational commanders. But I think the fact is that we were ill-prepared. Krishna Menon asks for 60 crores for improving our defenses on the Chinese border. Morarji Desai gives 20 crores. Krishna Menon appeals to Nehru. He gets 20 crores more. See, Nehru's style was not the style of some prime ministers we know. Nehru's style was, if Morarji has said out of 60 he can give you only 20, so be it. By the way, the relationship between Morarji and Nehru was extraordinary. And Nehru has written that Morarji was one of the finest administrators he's ever encountered in public life. So that's how Nehru operated. He allowed Pant to be home minister. He allowed Morarji to be finance minister. So it is true that India underinvested in defense, but it underinvested because we had a finance minister who believed that investment in defense was anti-Gandhi. was not in India's interest. Now you can say, but Nehru should have put his foot down. Nehru should have increased defense expenditure. Yeah, but these are retrospective judgments. And the Prime Minister did not operate as a dictator. I think the important thing to recognize is Nehru was authoritative. He was not authoritarian. If he was authoritarian, he could have told his cabinet, I want this agreement with China. Be it. Let's have this agreement. But he didn't do it. He could have told Morarji Desai, please give Krishna Menon 60 crores for buying the equipment. But he didn't function that way. Subsequently, we have learnt our lesson. But it was a very costly lesson. I agree with you. It was a trauma. And it still traumatizes us. Our entire view of China is influenced by what happened in 1962. But please remember, sir, and we forget this, China's attack was a surprise. China's withdrawal was a greater surprise. They withdrew from, we still don't know why they attacked us. We still don't know why they withdrew. They withdrew from every inch of territory they had occupied in 1962. So if they had any forward ambitions, they should have hung on to Tawang. They should have hung on to some territory, but they didn't. I think the truth is they wanted to teach India a lesson. That was the thing. Sorry? Mao, yes, in fact, it's true. In fact, that's true. There is that Mao wanted to teach Nehru a lesson, and Nehru basically was a broken man after 1962.
Thank you very much.
More power to your arm, and we look forward to another similar biography, maybe longer.
Not after 2024.
Well, you have not got much time then. So, it was a pleasure. The discussion, your elephantine knowledge of our entire years that have gone by. Congratulations. Thank you.